Katy mentions in her piece, and she mentioned China there, that one of the big tests for the Labour Party coming up will be whether or not it chooses to put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles coming into the UK. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, what we have is a situation where the European Union are putting tariffs on imports of Chinese electrical vehicles, and the United States have done so. So we have a decision to make. At the moment, it looks to me as if Labour are resisting the temptation to do this. And I think the car industry here is saying, actually, it's not going to make a load of difference if you put those tariffs on. But you're right. Ultimately, one of the big choices that the government is going to have to make is how closely aligned on decisions like this we want to be with either the US or the European Union. And it's an open question as yet what Labour decide. I mean, there are lots of things wrapped up with this. For instance, are we going to link ourselves with their emissions trading scheme? I think Katy's absolutely right that on things like alignment, the Labour Party is far more relaxed than the Conservative Party in power was. I think the big question in terms of the sorts of deals she was talking about is not so much whether Labour is willing to make concessions that the Conservatives wouldn't, because I think the answer is yes, but whether the EU is willing to give ground on any of those things. And there I'm far less certain, to be honest, that they're going to play nicely and actually play ball with the sorts of things that Labour wants to talk about and negotiate.
Katy, you mentioned earlier that the idea of being a rule taker rather than a rule maker and kind of signing up to European rules was considered toxic in the Conservative Party. But we never did really diverge when it came to standards anyway. Is Labour not really just kind of accepting the reality that they inherited from the Conservative Party?
So I think it's the reality they would want anyway, in the sense that Labour does, again, it's just not what they would take as saying Brexit as an opportunity to diverge and become, Singapore on the Thames, as some used to say about Brexit. I think the Tories have made it much easier for Labour to do this pivot, in the sense that if it was the case that after the Brexit referendum, the Tories had managed to strike these trade deals, and obviously they did strike a few, but then there was a noticeable improvement in living standards, and there was not a cost of living crisis, but actually a sense that, in the supermarkets, X and X, and then of course it was suddenly then be a lot harder to say, oh no, we're going to do this policy pivot. But because there is little noticeable difference there, and I think not that many opportunities were taken in some of these other areas, you combine that with the fact that, if you look at polling, I think about 60% of voters now think Brexit was a mistake. You look at obviously one of the biggest claims of Brexit, which was like you could take back control of borders. Well, the number of small boat crossings, I think, means that few would say, oh, that is a Brexit freedom that has been really felt in this country. And therefore, I think Tory failures have meant that Keir Starmer can do a lot of this stuff, and there's not going to be a huge controversy. I think there'll still be a huge controversy if freedom of movement came back, because it is a totemic thing. It's this idea of, endless, there's no limit and so forth. But I think that would be a red line in terms of voter appetite. But also, I don't think most voters were thinking about these trading things. It's more a focus in the Tory party. And it does give Keir Starmer quite a lot of space to do lots of these things. And therefore, I think that, there are little changes, and I think some of it is, I don't think you are going to get a huge voter backlash on a lot of this stuff. But of course, there is a question, which is, if you are just aligning, if you are trying to get closer with Brussels, it does eventually beg the question of, what is the point of leaving the EU? And then do you eventually, maybe in a changed political world, get back into a point where people say, well, we're not using any of these Brexit bonuses anyway, or these apparent Brexit bonuses, so shouldn't we just be all in? So I think the trajectory is what's interesting in terms of, are people going to say Brexit is good when you have ultimately just had a closer relationship with Europe, but it's not as beneficial as the one you were originally in? I think that's the risk of this outcome.